After Acts 11, the scene shifts from Peter to Paul. Paul, who was a Pharisee, was the leader of the Jewish resistance to the church. He has a powerful vision of the risen Christ and becomes a Christian himself. He returns to Tarsus and spends some time in the desert working it all out. Eventually, Barnabas fetches him to help out at Antioch. We get that in Acts 11. We then have much of Acts following his journeys, where he founds churches and encourages others. He has a vision of bringing the wealth of the nations to Jerusalem in fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies, which we find in Isaiah 65 or Isaiah 61:6, Zechariah 14:14. So despite a discouragement from the prophet Agabus in Acts 21, he goes to Jerusalem. And there a Jewish plot leads to him to appealing to Caesar. He goes to Rome. And it's while there that he writes to the churches he has founded. And so that's where we get the first books that we call books of the New Testament. They're letters from Paul. We don't have all those letters. For example, in the 2 Corinthians letters we have, there's an implication of other letters with material which isn't covered in the ones we have got. We get other letters written by other authors. And then in his old age, John, who may or not be the same as the evangelist, records his vision. In fact, it's quite likely it's not the same as the evangelist because of the word patterns that he uses. His style of using Greek is really quite distinctive from the style used by the evangelist and the person who writes the 3 letters that we do attribute to John the Evangelist. I've said the letters are the earliest writing in the New Testament. Eventually, the Gospels get written. See, the apostles were dying, some early, some later, but it became important that what they had witnessed was recorded. It was a literary age, and so although things could and had been passed on by word of mouth, it was important to get things written down. Actually, up until the fact that they started dying, it was assumed that Jesus would return soon. Thessalonians, for example, by Paul, is writing to people to explain why people are dying before Jesus has come back. Eventually, it becomes clear the end of the age is not coming quite yet. The age of the church might last some time. And so different writers record what the apostles had experienced. Matthew and John have significant material from the apostles themselves. Some people debate on John whether it's actually John who wrote the final version we have today. If you look at the ending, you can see why that debate is. Matthew is generally taken as written by Matthew. Luke wasn't an apostle. He seems to have sought out various sources, including Paul. Mark probably had Peter as his main source. Just stop for a minute. Which of the Gospels is the odd one out then? I hope you spotted that is Luke's Gospel, with Paul as his main source, who wasn't one of Jesus's disciples in his lifetime. But these are not the only apostles. An apostle was someone who has seen Jesus' teaching, witnessed his resurrection, and was sent to tell others. Romans 16:7 is interesting here. Greet Mary, who has worked very hard among you. Greet Andronicus and Junia, my relatives who were in prison with me. They are prominent among the apostles, and they were in Christ before I was. And then you get a little star which says, or Junius. Other ancient authorities read Julia. This is a woman who's being called an apostle by Paul. And some people speak of Mary Magdalene as the apostle to the apostles. She was with Jesus, she'd seen Jesus' teaching, she witnessed his resurrection and was sent to tell others. So, a very fast canter through the history of the early church as we have it in the Bible. But there are other documents that could have made it into the Bible and didn't. We'll see later it took several centuries before the church agreed which books were to be the collection of Christian writings that would be honoured as highly as the Jewish scriptures. Several very early documents didn't make it. These include the Didache. And if you look now, you'll find on Moodle some extracts from the Didache. This included teaching on various aspects of church life. So if you pause this now, go and read those. When you've read it, ask yourself what strikes you about this. And in its description of the worship of the church, how does it compare to what we do today? Those will be questions that we'll be discussing when we get back to have our discussion for this second part of the first session. Other near misses were the Shepherd of Hermas, which is a series of visions and parables, and the letter of Barnabas. And so we have Barnabas 1:6. Well then, there are 3 ordinances of the Lord, the hope of life, which is the beginning and end of our faith, and righteousness, which is the beginning and end of judgment, love shown in gladness and exultation, the testimony of works of righteousness. These writings, while not honoured in the same way as the Bible, are well worth reading for themselves, and this early first century teaching of the church. We also have something called the Gospel of the Hebrews. We don't have the complete text of that. For some time it was thought to be a Hebrew version of the Gospel of Matthew, but later it was decided it was derivative. And if you want to go and read those all, you can go online. Just Google them and you'll very easily find them. There are other books which were never considered by the early church as part of their received tradition. For example, you have books like the Gospel of Thomas. See, those books were written by other groups of people. In particular, the Gospel of Thomas was written by a group of people called the Gnostics. And they actually show understanding of Jesus as quite different from how the church understood Jesus. But we'll be looking at that later. In your next session, which is with Luigi, you'll be looking at the history of the early church from early Rome to Constantine and thinking about some of those groups of people who found different ways of thinking about Jesus which didn't form what was in the end accepted about him by the church.